Chapter 55. The Retired Officer. Lord Alcarn's introduction opened the door faster than Kael expected. A short, formal letter, and 3 days later a reply inviting them to visit. Cautious, but not unwelcoming, from a man named Tobias Marsh, who'd spent 30 years processing guild transfer paperwork before retiring to a small cottage 2 districts east. He was old, spare, sharp-eyed in the way of someone who'd spent a career noticing small administrative details other people missed, and he studied Kael for a long moment on his own doorstep before saying, "You're the Solari boy, the one from all the recent guild gossip." A pause. "You've got Osric Dre's old district written all over your file, if a man knows where to look. I assume that's why Lord Alcarn's letter mentioned you specifically." "It is." "Come in, then. I've been half expecting someone to ask me about that transfer for 15 years. Didn't expect it to be a teenager. But I suppose 15 years is long enough for expectations to get creative." Over tea, with Wren quietly taking notes, and Seraphine sitting close enough to Kael that her presence felt, without either of them saying anything about it, like its own kind of support, Marsh told them what he remembered. "Dre's transfer came through with an authorization I'd never seen before and never saw again," he said. "Normal district-to-capital transfers take months, go through 6 different approval stages. His took 11 days. The paperwork had a departmental seal on it that outranked everything else in the file. And when I asked my supervisor about it, carefully, mind, I wasn't looking for trouble, I was told, very plainly, to stop asking." He set his teacup down. "I did stop asking. I had a family to feed and a pension to protect, and I told myself it wasn't my business. I've had 15 years to decide whether that was a coward's choice or a sensible one. I still haven't fully decided." "Do you remember anything about the seal itself?" Wren asked. "Any identifying mark beyond the authorization symbol?" Marsh was quiet for a moment, then reached into an old, battered writing desk and produced a single yellowed carbon copy. A transfer request. Faded, but legible. The departmental seal stamped clearly at its base. "Kept a copy," he admitted. "Told myself it was just careful record-keeping. I think, if I'm honest, some part of me always suspected I might need it someday." He slid it across the table. "That symbol, 3 interlocking rings, with a small mark at the center I never could identify. I asked around, quietly, over the years. Nobody in ordinary guild administration recognized it. Whatever office that seal belongs to, it doesn't advertise itself in the parts of the guild an ordinary registrar ever gets to see." Wren pressed her palm flat against the paper the moment it was in her hands, going still in the way that had become familiar over the past weeks, and after a long moment, breathed out slowly. "There's a name under this too," she said. "Buried deeper than the last one. Barely legible even to me." She looked up, pale. "It's not a person's name. It's an organization. 3 words, and I can only make out 2 of them clearly." "Which 2?" Kael asked, already bracing. "The and undersigned," Wren said, and Kael felt the last piece of a name he'd been half joking about for days settle, suddenly and entirely unfunny, into place. Chapter 56. Under Attack. They made it barely 2 days back in Ashenreach before the undersigned answered. And they answered, Kael would think later, in exactly the way a organization that had spent 200 years staying hidden would, quietly, deniably, aimed at the weakest point instead of the strongest one. It was Denner's outpost records room that burned. Late on the second night, a fire that started, according to the outpost's own investigators, consistent with an unattended lamp. A conclusion nobody in the room actually believed for a single second, least of all Denner himself, who arrived at the smoking wreckage with soot on his hands and fury in his face that Kael had never once seen from the mild-mannered requisition officer in the entire time he'd known him. Every physical copy of the district's old oversight paperwork, Denner said, scratching his neck hard enough to leave a mark, staring at the ruined records room. Gone. Marsh's carbon copy is the only surviving physical evidence, and that's sitting 2 districts away in an old man's writing desk. Which means he's a target too, Kael finished, already moving. We need to warn him. Now, operator, I would caution against rushing there directly. If the undersigned struck here, they may already anticipate exactly this response, and may already have people watching the road to his cottage. Halden, arriving at a run, confirmed the worst of Kael's fear within the hour. A guild courier dispatched at first light to check on Marsh had returned white-faced, reporting the old man safe but shaken. His cottage broken into overnight, nothing stolen but the desk itself splintered open and searched. They didn't find the copy, Holden said, relief and grim fury warring in her voice. Marsh had already sent it ahead to Wren through a private courier the same morning we left. Good instincts, or good luck, I'm not sure which. And right now I don't especially care. Wren, pale but steady, produced the carbon copy from where she'd kept it hidden, folded small, inside the lining of her own coat since the day they'd returned. I didn't want to leave it anywhere that wasn't attached to me, she admitted. Call it instinct. I've apparently got good ones now, along with everything else. You have excellent ones, Halden said. Keep them, all of you. She looked around the small, exhausted group. Kael, Wren, Bryce, Seraphine, with something fierce and protective settling into her expression. This confirms it. Whoever's behind this is real, active, and willing to burn guild property to keep their secret buried. That's not a provincial matter anymore, and I'm done pretending it might be for anyone's comfort, including my own. She straightened. Decision made. I'm escalating to Marrow directly, tonight, by my own hand, carried by someone I trust completely and no one else. And I want every one of you under closer watch until we know exactly how far this actually reaches. Kael looked at the smoking ruin of the records room. A fire meant, he understood now, not to hurt anyone directly, but to erase, quietly, the exact kind of evidence his mother had died trying to bring into the light 15 years ago, and felt the last of any lingering doubt about the stakes burn away along with it. They're scared, he said quietly. That's what this is. They're not confident enough to come at us directly yet. They're scared enough to burn a building instead. An astute observation, operator. Fear is not the same as safety, but it does tell us something useful. Whatever the undersigned actually are, they are not yet certain they can win this outright. That is not comfort, but it is, at least, information. Chapter 57. Closing ranks. Marrow's response, when it came 6 days later, arrived not as a letter, but as the man himself. A full guild carriage rolling into Ashen Reaches Square with an escort of 6 armed hunters, and an expression that suggested he'd traveled the entire distance in a barely contained fury he hadn't yet decided where to aim. I've spent 30 years in this guild believing its worst failures were incompetence, he said, in the outpost's back room. Once Halden's carefully assembled evidence sat spread across the table between them. Denner's records room, burning 2 days after a retired registrar gets his cottage searched, is not incompetence. That's a coordinated response to a threat someone believes is credible. He looked up, lined face grim. I am formally opening a full investigative task force, effective today, operating outside the talent division's normal reporting structure entirely. I do not yet know how far up this reaches. Until I do, everyone in this room reports directly to me, and no one else. What about Dre? Kael asked. Dre is currently under discreet surveillance, as of 3 days ago, on my personal authority, Marrow said. He does not know it yet. I intend to keep it that way as long as possible. He studied Kael for a long moment. I understand there's far more to this than an old cover-up, Master Rennick. Officer Halden's report mentions something about the deep root that I confess I do not fully understand. and would like explained to me directly by whatever source actually possesses that information. Kael glanced down at his own chest, where Ashen had gone quiet and careful in the way it always did before a decision that mattered. Your choice, operator. I have no objection to speaking with him directly, if you trust his discretion. You can talk to him, Kael said. Ashen, this is Adjudicator Marrow. He's the reason I got a fair hearing at all. I trust him. It took the better part of 2 hours, Ashen explaining carefully. Marrow interrupting with the same blunt, practical questions Kael himself had asked days earlier, before the old adjudicator finally sat back, looking, for the first time since Kael had met him, genuinely shaken. An ancient containment class, deliberately erased 2 centuries ago, protecting a 15-year cover-up that killed 2 researchers to keep an active deep-root site quiet, he summarized, slowly. And a boy who happens to be both the sole known machinist in living memory and the orphaned son of the researchers who nearly exposed it. He shook his head. If I'd read this in a report from anyone else, I'd have assumed exaggeration or outright fabrication. I have spent 2 days watching evidence for it accumulate in front of me instead. What happens now? Seraphine asked. Now, Marrow said. The Guild's full resources go toward 2 things simultaneously: finding out exactly who the undersigned actually are, and ensuring this district, and this boy specifically, are properly protected while we do it. He looked at Kael directly. You are, as of today, formally under Guild protective oversight, Master Rennick. Not house arrest, protection. I've lost track of how many ways this organization has already shown they're willing to hurt people to keep their secret, and I am not adding you to that list on my watch. Kael thought about a scrapyard full of badly named machines, a friend who could read secrets out of old paper, a town that had finally learned his name for the right reasons, and felt, underneath the fear, something steadier taking root. Understood, he said. But I'm not sitting this out. Whatever comes next, I want to be part of it. Marrow studied him for a long moment, then, unexpectedly, allowed himself something close to a smile. I'd have been disappointed if you'd said anything else. Chapter 58. The boundary holds. For now, with Marrow's task force settling into Ashenreach, and a genuine Guild protective detail, now quietly stationed around anyone connected to the investigation, Kael finally allowed himself, for the first time in weeks, something like a full night's sleep, and woke the next morning to news from Tamsin that felt, against every recent trend, almost like relief. Boundaries stabilized, she reported, meeting them at the outpost, with dust still on her boots from an overnight perimeter check. Hasn't moved another inch in 6 days. Whatever caused the migration, it's gone quiet again. Not retreated. Not that lucky, but quiet. Same pattern the old records described for a deep root settling back into dormancy after a partial stir, according to the historical fragments your machine helped us cross-reference. So it's not happening yet, Kael said. The full cycle, not yet, Tamsin agreed, which is good news, and also, I suspect, borrowed time rather than a resolution. Nothing about what your machine described suggests these things stay quiet forever. She studied him for a moment, weathered and unsentimental as ever. For what it's worth, Rennick, I've been doing this job a long time, and I've never once seen a threat this size get handled by panic. It gets handled by people doing the plain work, day after day, until the ground under them is solid enough to stand on. You're doing that work. Don't let the size of the story convince you it isn't enough. It was, Kael thought, possibly the kindest thing Tamsin had ever said to him, delivered with all the warmth of someone reading a weather report, which somehow made it land harder rather than softer. Life in Ashenreach, in the days that followed, took on a strange, doubled quality. Ordinary on the surface, market days and chapel service and Fenn's scrapyard humming along exactly as it always had, while underneath it, A genuine guild task force quietly worked through evidence. Protective escorts trailed at a discreet distance. And everyone who knew the full truth carried it like a stone in their pocket. Present, but not always spoken of. Bryce adapted to it the way he adapted to most things now. Bluntly, practically, folding the danger into his training regimen, rather than letting it sit as a separate fear. If something's coming eventually, he told Kael, mid-drill, spear resetting into stance. I want to be strong enough that it doesn't matter whether it's a sandjaw pack or whatever a deep root apparently is. Difference is just degree, right? Train for degree. That's either very wise or very reckless. With me, it's usually both, Bryce said, echoing Seraphine so precisely that Kael actually laughed out loud. And Bryce, pleased with himself without entirely understanding why, grinned and reset his stance again. Ren, meanwhile, had thrown herself into chronicler training with the same stubborn thoroughness she brought to everything, working through the guild's oldest surviving archive fragments under Ashen's patient guidance, piecing together scraps of 200-year-old history, one careful reading at a time. I found a reference to a second deep root site, she told Kael one evening, exhausted but electric with the discovery. Not here. Somewhere west, past the mountains, in a district I've never heard of. Old record, half destroyed. If there's one somewhere else, Kael. This isn't just Ashenreach's problem. It never was. Confirmed, Ashen said quietly. I had suspected as much, but lacked confirmation. This changes the scale of what we may eventually be asked to do, operator. Significantly beyond one valley. Kael sat with that, the weight of it settling in alongside everything else he'd learned to carry over the past few extraordinary months, and found, somewhat to his own surprise, that it didn't frighten him nearly as much as it once might have. One valley at a time, he said. That's how I got this far. I don't see a reason to change the plan now just because the map got bigger. A sound plan, operator, Ashen said. And then, after a pause just long enough to notice, though I will note, for the record, the boundary has been quiet for 6 days now. In my experience, there are two kinds of quiet. The kind that means a thing is finished, and the kind that means a thing is listening. I have not yet determined which this is. Chapter 59. Second Ring. Second Nature. With the boundary stable and Marrow's task force settled in, Halden authorized something that would have been unthinkable half a year earlier. A standing second ring cull rotation, Tamsin leading, Kael's constructs as the backbone. A deliberate, methodical thinning of the beast population that 2 decades of understaffed patrols had let accumulate in the deep's middle dark. Think of it as paying down a debt, Tamsin said, on the first rotation, moving through the green-black gloom with the unhurried economy of someone reading a room she'd survived 100 times. Every beast we cull out here is one that doesn't ride the next surge into somebody's farm. Boring, careful, repetitive work. She glanced back at Kael, dry as dust. Your favorite kind, if the rumors are true. The second ring's beasts were a different economy altogether. D-rank cores as the standard take. The occasional C-rank territorial that took the whole rotation working in concert. And once, memorably, something none of them had ever seen before. System notification. New beast cataloged. Shale wolf. D-rank. Silicate armored pack hunter. Hide fragments exhibit unusual, ether-conductive lattice structure. Blueprint synthesis. New schematic derived. Shale hide plating. Construct armor. D-grade. It's learning from them, Ren said, watching from the rotation's protected center as Kael turned to Shale Wolf's armored fragment over in his hands, the schematic already unspooling behind his eyes. Every new beast you fight, the system hands you a piece of it. That's, Kael, that's not just leveling. That's a library, and the Deep's been stocking it for 200 years. An apt framing, Ashen agreed. The historical machinist did not merely defend against the Deep, operator. They studied it, armored themselves in it. Every containment lattice in the old fragments was built, in part, from the very things it contained. You are not the first to notice the flywheel. You are simply the first in 2 centuries to be allowed to turn it. By the fourth rotation, the numbers told their own story. Kael's frontline constructs plated in shale hide, cutting losses per cull to nearly nothing. The core ledger Denner maintained growing thick enough that he'd requisitioned a second book, Bryce hitting the E-rank ceiling hard enough in one engagement that his own system flagged a threshold coming. It was, Kael thought, the strangest and best season of his life. Dangerous, repetitive, profitable, and shared. It was on the 5th rotation that Old Scuttle, ranging invisible at the formation's edge the way it had appointed itself to do, went suddenly, rigidly still, and Kael felt what it felt through the communion link. A half-second later, they were being watched. Not by a beast. Beasts felt like hunger, or territory, or fear. This felt like attention, patient, human, and carefully positioned exactly at the edge of the rotation's sensing range, in a place no civilian and no hunter had any business standing. By the time Tamsin's arrow was knocked and Kael's constructs had pivoted, the Watcher was gone. No trail, no scent, nothing but a single flattened patch of undergrowth and, pressed into the soft earth at its center, deliberately, unmistakably left to be found, a plain wax seal, 3 interlocking rings. They want us to know they're watching, Tamsin said flatly, turning the seal over once before dropping it into an evidence pouch. That's not carelessness. That's a message. Agreed, Ashen said quietly. And operator, messages of this kind are rarely sent alone. I would expect its companion to arrive soon, and considerably closer to home. It arrived 11 days later, at dusk, at the scrapyard gate. Chapter 60. The Messenger. The stranger found him alone, which Kael understood immediately, even before anything else was said, meant the encounter had been planned with considerable care. Marrow's protective detail rotated shifts every 4 hours, and this man had clearly chosen the exact 10-minute gap between them. He was unremarkable in a way that felt deliberate. Plain traveling clothes, no visible crest or guild marking, standing at the scrapyard gate at dusk with his hands visibly empty and open. The posture of someone who wanted to be read, immediately, as no threat at all. Kael Rennick, he said, pleasant, unhurried. My associates call me the Auditor. I represent people who would very much like to avoid this becoming any more complicated than it already has. Operator. I do not detect a weapon. I do detect considerable aether suppression technology on his person, sophisticated enough that I cannot read his class or rank. I would recommend extreme caution regardless. The undersigned, Kael said, keeping his voice level, keeping his hands loose and ready near the scrap satchel at his hip. I assume. The man's expression flickered, briefly, genuine surprise breaking through the practiced pleasantness. You've gotten further than we anticipated. That's noted, for the record. He recovered quickly. I'm not here to threaten you, whatever the burned records room might have suggested to your friends. I'm here to make an offer, on behalf of people who understand your class far better than the guild currently does. Go on. The deep root cycle you've apparently learned about is real, and it is coming, regardless of anything either of us does about it. What isn't inevitable is who leads the response when it arrives. My associates have spent 2 centuries managing that response quietly, carefully, without triggering the kind of panic that gets entire kingdoms burned to the ground by their own fear. He studied Kael, unhurried. We would like to bring you into that work. Properly. Resources, training, access to knowledge about your own class that no guild archive currently possesses. In exchange, we would ask only that you stop pulling on threads that lead nowhere good for anyone, including you. You killed my parents. We made a decision 15 years ago that a research expedition risked exposing something the world was not ready to understand. the man said, and there was no cruelty in his voice at all, which somehow made it worse. I won't pretend that decision cost nothing. I will tell you it wasn't made lightly, and that the alternative, mass panic about an ancient world-ending entity, spreading faster than any containment plan could manage, has cost considerably more lives, historically, than the quiet alternative ever has. Operator, I do not trust this individual's framing, but I would note his organization has just, effectively, confirmed everything we suspected, unprompted. Apparently believing you would find the justification persuasive. That is useful information, regardless of what you decide to say next. Kael looked at the man. Calm, reasonable, terribly convinced of his own righteousness, and felt something cold and absolutely certain settle into his chest. You're not going to convince me that burying the truth is safer than telling it, he said. My mother tried to tell people, and you killed her for it. I'm not making the same mistake of trusting people like you to decide what the rest of us are ready to know. The man's pleasant expression didn't fully crack, but something underneath it went noticeably colder. That's a disappointing answer, Kael Rennick. I'd hoped you might be more practical than your mother was. I take that as a compliment. You shouldn't. The man stepped back, unhurried, already fading toward the tree line at the scrapyard's edge, with the particular ease of someone who'd planned an exit as carefully as an entrance. We'll speak again. Sooner than you'd like, I suspect. Do consider, in the meantime, how much you're willing to risk on behalf of people who can't possibly understand what's actually coming. He was gone before Kael could respond, vanished into the dusk with a completeness that suggested Ashen's aether suppression assessment had been, if anything, an understatement. And Kael stood alone at the scrapyard gate for a long moment afterward, heart hammering, before he finally turned and ran for the outpost to tell Marrow exactly what had just happened. Chapter 61. What Kael Chooses. Marrow doubled the protective detail within the hour, tightened the perimeter around the scrapyard, and spent most of the night personally reviewing every word Kael could remember of the encounter. But by the time the sun came up, exhausted and thoroughly debriefed, Kael found he didn't want to talk about strategy or threat assessment anymore. He wanted, more than anything, to sit quietly with the people who'd actually make any of it bearable. Seraphine found him on the scrapyard's back step, watching the sunrise with a cup of tea he hadn't touched, going cold in his hands. You told him no, she said, sitting down beside him without asking. Everyone's talking about the strategic implications. I'd like to know how you actually feel about it. Kael considered the question honestly, turning it over the way he turned over everything. Scared, he admitted. That man was so calm about it, so sure he was right. It would almost be easier if the people doing this were obviously monsters. It's harder to fight someone who genuinely believes they're protecting the world by keeping it in the dark. But you still said no, because being right about the danger doesn't make you right about the answer. He looked at her, some of the fear settling, finally, into something steadier. My mother tried to tell people the truth, and it got her killed. I could look at that and decide the lesson is, don't tell the truth. Or I could decide the lesson is, tell it anyway, but don't be alone when you do. He glanced back toward the scrapyard, toward Wren's window, where a lamp was already burning despite the early hour, toward the outpost where Marrow's task force had worked through the night on his behalf. I'm not alone. That's the difference between me and her. 15 years ago, that's the whole difference. Seraphine was quiet for a moment, something unguarded and certain in her expression. For what it's worth, she said, I don't think you're choosing the safer path. I think you know that, and you're choosing it anyway, because it's the honest one. I find that much more compelling than safety would be. Is that your way of saying you approve? It's my way of saying, Seraphine said, steady and entirely certain, that whatever comes next, I intend to be standing exactly where I am right now, beside you, not behind, not somewhere safer, here. Kael, cold tea forgotten entirely, found he had nothing clever left to say to that at all, and didn't especially need to. Ren found them there an hour later, still deep in conversation, and slotted herself onto the step between them without ceremony, the way she always did. "Marrow wants everyone at the outpost by noon," she reported. "Full briefing on next steps, apparently, now that the undersigned have officially introduced themselves." She studied Kael for a moment, something warmer than her usual teasing underneath the report. "You okay? Genuinely?" "Genuinely, yeah." Kael stood, offering Seraphine a hand up beside him, and found, looking between the two of them, his oldest friend, his newest certainty, that the fear from last night had settled, quietly, into something closer to resolve. "Scared, but okay. There's a difference, apparently. Tamsin taught me that one." "Good," Ren said, "because I've got a feeling okay's going to have to carry us pretty far from here." She fell into step beside them as they headed for the outpost gate, the early morning sun finally warming the dew off Fenn's scrapyard. A patient row of badly named machines standing sentry on the workbench behind them. "Also, for the record," I called it. "The undersigned. I want that officially noted in whatever history eventually gets written about this." "Duly noted," Kael said, and found, walking toward whatever came next with people who'd earned the right to walk there beside him, that he could actually smile about it. Chapter 62. What comes next? Marrow's briefing, when it came, was less a plan and more an honest accounting of how much work actually remained. "We don't know the undersigned's full reach yet," he told the assembled group. Kael, Ren, Seraphine, Bryce, Holden, Denner, Tamsin, Joran, all crowded into the outpost's largest room for the first time since the crisis had begun. "We don't know how many districts they've quietly shaped decisions in, how many other cover-ups sit buried the way this one nearly stayed. What we do know is that they've now shown their hand twice, the fire and the approach to Kael directly, which means they're worried enough to act and not yet confident enough to move openly. That's an advantage, however small. I intend to use it." "Use it how?" Bryce asked, carefully, patiently. "The same way this entire investigation has gotten anywhere at all." Marrow looked around the room, something steady and determined in his weathered face. "I'm establishing a permanent task force presence in this district, effective immediately, and I'm recommending, formally, to the capital, that guild resources be redirected toward proper historical research into the deep-root phenomenon, using Kael's class and Ashen's memory as the foundation. If there's truly a second sight, as Ren's research suggests, we need to understand what we're actually facing before any cycle reaches its peak, here or anywhere else." Kael, listening, felt the shape of the months ahead settle into something almost like clarity. Not simple, not safe, but finally, genuinely understood. Training, investigation, a slow, careful building of exactly the kind of coordinated response Ashen had described 2 centuries of history nearly losing entirely. System notification, class status, machinist, B rank, drone sovereign, tier 3, historical data fully restored, deep root archive, machinist origin record. Note: full evolution toward the class's original purpose remains gated behind further growth, further trial, and, per surviving fragment, genuine readiness rather than raw capability. You are not there yet. You are, however, far closer than you were this morning. "How long until we're ready?" Seraphine asked, echoing the question Kael suspected everyone in the room was quietly holding. "I don't know," Marrow admitted, honest in a way Kael had come to genuinely respect. "Could be years, could be less, if the undersigned force our hands sooner than we'd like. What I do know is that 6 months ago, this district had no idea any of this existed at all. And today it has a guild task force, a confirmed machinist, a chronicler who can read secrets out of buried ink, and a room full of people who've already proven they won't back down when it matters. He looked at Kael directly. That's not nothing, Master Rennick. That's the beginning of exactly the coordinated response the old records describe. You built more of it than you probably realize. Just by refusing to stay quiet, the meeting broke up slowly, people drifting off into the ordinary business of an afternoon that no longer felt quite so ordinary. And Kael walked back to the scrapyard with Wren on one side and Seraphine on the other, Bryce trailing a few steps behind, still turning the day's revelations over in his own head, and felt, for the first time in weeks, something that wasn't quite peace, but was close enough to it to hold on to. Fen was waiting at the gate when they arrived, arms crossed, studying all four of them with the particular weathered patience of a man who'd clearly already guessed most of what the meeting had covered. "Well," he said, "is that so?" "It's a lot of 'is that so,' honestly," Kael admitted. "Figured." Fen nodded toward the workbench, where a small army of badly named machines sat exactly where he'd left them, patient and waiting. "Get some rest tonight. Whatever's coming, it can wait until morning to actually start." Kael looked at the workbench and his friends, and the dark, quiet shape of the Ashwood Deep sitting patient on the horizon. A story 6 months in the making, with a great deal more of it still ahead, and found, for once, that he was genuinely looking forward to finding out what came next.